You said that you were an accident reconstructionist, but also a biomechanical engineer. How is your work as a biomechanical engineer different than an accident reconstructionist?
So simply, you can think of biomechanics as similar, but to everything inside the car. So biomechanics is looking at how the effects of physical forces are applied to the human anatomy. When I'm trying to explain to somebody what I do, I say, hey, it's like a civil engineer who's designing a bridge. So many trucks and cars on the bridge. Are that going to cause the beams in the bridge to fail? Is that going to cause the cables to fail? So a human body is governed by the same laws of physics, just like the bridge. Obviously, it's made of a lot of different materials, but in the human body, my beams are bones. My cables are the muscles and ligaments. Different material properties, but everything's governed by the laws of physics and principles of engineering. So I'm looking at how physical forces, the outside of the car, when people are inside the car, seatbelts, airbags. The first seatbelt was patented by an engineer. It's engineers who quantify the force of the crash and what kind of injury damage there is to the body. So it is force that causes damage like a fracture. And so we're looking at how the physical forces are applied to the body and what that means in terms of what happens to the body. I went to university and got my undergraduate degree in mechanical engineering. From there, I happened to be at a Thursday meeting of the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. A group came in from a company that did this type of work, and they showed some examples of how you apply engineering concepts that you learn in mechanical engineering to the human body. And so I was like, man, that's a great job. That's the perfect mix of engineering that I have and my desire, to learn the medical side of things as well without becoming a doctor. So I talked to them. I actually applied to the company and was ultimately hired as a biomechanical engineer.
How long did you continue as a biomechanical engineer until you went back to school?
So I actually, very quickly after I started the job, I took a human anatomy class at a community college. I quickly realized that wasn't enough. And so in around 1993, I went to the USC Medical School and enrolled to what's called concurrent enrollment, which means you can take the class, but you're not actually in medical school. It's a medical school class. But I took gross human anatomy. So it was me and 160 or so other doctors. I took the same human anatomy that first year medical students at USC took. So it began in 1993.
Did you continue to work as you pursued your higher education?
I ultimately started my own company, continued to work, continued to do research, and a wonderful opportunity to have two beautiful children, and continue to this day.
Based on your analysis, data available, reviews, study, based on the fact that you are an accident reconstructionist and a biomedical engineer, have you reached an opinion to a reasonable degree of engineering certainty whether the defendant's Lexus struck Mr. John O'Keefe on January 29, 2022, around 12:32 a.m.?
Yes.
And could you share the bases of your opinion before I ask you your ultimate opinion?
So based on the 130 slides you've seen, based on my personal inspection of the Lexus, the correlation of the tech stream data with the infotainment data, as well as Mr. O'Keefe's cell phone data, it's looking at, I guess, where the taillight wasn't broken. It's looking at the physical evidence at the scene in terms of taillight fragments, glass fragments, red color in the snow. We have the cell phone data, the location and position of the arm lacerations, the air temperature at the time indicative of sufficient to freeze, the location of the fracture on the back of his head relative to the scientific literature, my testing of forces available falling onto a hard surface, published science on the fracture forces associated with falls. I've inspected the Lexus. I've looked at where it wasn't damaged. I've inspected the Lexus. I've looked at where it wasn't damaged. I've inspected the taillight. I got an exemplar Lexus. I ran lower speed contacts to verify that the injury pattern and location on the arm is consistent with the height and orientation of the taillight. I have looked at fracture tolerance data for falling backwards onto hard surfaces. I've looked at the metrics of where his injuries were and what injuries he didn't sustain. I've looked at the cell phone data, and then I've looked at Miss Reed's interviews as well. And then I've looked at Miss Reed's interviews as well.
Based on all the evidence you considered, could you share with the jury what your opinion is to a reasonable degree of engineering certainty about whether the defendant's Lexus struck Mr. O'Keefe on January 29, 2022, around 12:32 a.m.?
I can answer. Yes, based on the totality of the evidence, DNA, everything I talked about, that is consistent with that happening with a reasonable degree of scientific certainty. That is what happened.
Objection, move to strike, Your Honor.
So I'm going to strike that. I'm going to see counsel's out for just
read the case materials, came up in his mind with what he's supposed to be looking for. And although he kept saying, the facts are what the facts are, to admit repeatedly towards the end of the day, when asked to summarize what led him to come to his opinion, and the first words out of his mouth were Karen's interviews, that's not science. When asked to summarize what led him to come to his opinion, and the first words out of his mouth were Karen's interviews, and the first words out of his mouth were Karen's interviews, and the first words out of his mouth were Karen's interviews.
did you consider any other locations of Mr. O'Keefe under your theory relative to the back of the SUV?
Sure. In the beginning of this, I started about, hey, it's all over. It could be anywhere on the back of it. Then whittled it down based upon the evidence, started eliminating various hypotheses based upon the evidence, and came to this conclusion, eliminating hypotheses based upon the taillight fragments near his body, the lacerations, his height, the height of the taillight in a Lexus. So it was an iterative process.
Did you mention any of these supposed hypotheses in your direct testimony?
No, because I was able to reject them. I didn't come in here to tell these people what didn't happen. I came in here to tell them what I believe happened.
Would you agree, sir, that the scientific method earlier has the scientists identify various hypotheses, go with the data that supports it, but you show your math as to why you're rejecting hypotheses. As you said, you rejected them. I'm asking for proof that you considered other hypotheses. Do you have anything in writing, any notes at all, any videos, any tests that you did, documentation of other hypotheses other than picking this one? Do you have any documentation of that?
So I did a bunch of tests with the Lexus. I did backing tests. I looked at how the rear system worked to see if it would autonomously brake. I confirmed it did not, so I eliminated that as a hypothesis. I tested the steering. I tested the transmission, what 1, 2 represented. So I did a whole bunch of tests on the vehicle.
Any documentation that you did that?
I mean, I did do 1 static and 2 dynamic tests in very similar positions, though. So I did a total of 3 tests relative to the arm.
Where is the documentation for that, sir?
It's in the file. I gave it to you. The slides are some of it. It's 109, 110, 111, actually through, I guess, 121 deal with the testing of the hypothesis.
We'll come back to this at another time. Is it your testimony that no part of what you did in selecting this area, no part of it is confirmation bias? You say there's no confirmation bias at all in what you did. Is that your testimony?
That's certainly my goal. I try and eliminate all confirmational bias. I didn't start out at this particular location. This is where the physical evidence led me to. So I would say the conclusions are supported by the science.
My question is, did you engage in any confirmation? This will be my last question. Did you engage in any confirmation bias in terms of how you approach the issue that you have testified about in written reports?
The answer is still no. I didn't start out at this particular location. This is where the physical evidence led me to. So I would say the conclusions are supported by the science. I didn't start out at this particular location. This is where the physical evidence led me to. So I would say the conclusions are supported by the science. My conclusion is there are taillight fragments, a broken glass, lacerations to his arm, and his DNA on the back of the vehicle in the area of the taillight.
Sir, and Your Honor, I'm going to move to strike the DNA part of that answer for obvious reasons.
I'm not going to strike it.
Okay, so you're making assumptions. You're taking what you view to be certain data, and you're coming to a conclusion, but that is based upon circumstantial information, correct? Is that fair?
Are you calling like pieces of the taillight at the scene around his body circumstantial information?
Is that fair?
Are you calling like pieces of the taillight at the scene around his body circumstantial information? Are you calling like pieces of the taillight at the scene around his body circumstantial information?
Sir,
Agreed that John O'Keefe's injuries, or lack thereof, are inconsistent with having been struck by a vehicle at 24 miles per hour. I would say it's likely and unlikely at the same time, depending on the position of the body and the vehicle in question.
Also, Dr. Wolf told us that the fall would have been at a high velocity, not from a simple slip and fall. More like getting clipped by a vehicle traveling at 24 miles per hour. Yes, a contra coup injury can happen from drunk people falling down. That is something he said, but he got more specific about what happened in John O'Keefe's injuries, and it was not from a simple slip and fall.
Well, as he fell backwards and he struck his head, it was clearly at a very high speed.
I'm going to ask you to take a look at this photograph. Have you seen this photograph before?
Yes.
I want you to explain to us what you're seeing here and take us through the process of your observations.
Well, what we're seeing is an approximate 1.5 inch laceration with bridging tissue and contusions and abrasions. To us, that's just a classic blunt trauma injury. There's nothing other than just vanilla about it. This is what happens when soft tissue hits a solid ground. The skin tears apart a bit, but not through and through. As you can see, there's the bridging. You can see all the bruising or contusions and just the tear, a little bit serrated along the edges. This is what happens when soft tissue hits a solid ground. This is what happens when soft tissue hits a solid ground. This is what happens when soft tissue hits a solid ground. When you look at the pathology, the autopsy of his brain, you're looking at a subarachnoid hemorrhage, you're looking at a subdural hemorrhage, neither one of them which was huge or would have required surgery, as well as the contusions that I described in his frontal poles, in his temporal poles, and then the original bang, which was in the occipital area. These are all findings that you would see on a CT scan and an MRI scan without requiring an autopsy if he had made it to the emergency room. You're looking at a subarachnoid hemorrhage, you're looking at a subdural hemorrhage, neither one of them which was huge or would have required surgery, neither one of them which was huge or would have required surgery, neither one of them which was huge or would have required surgery, and the original bang, which was in the occipital area, and then the original bang, which was in the occipital area, and then the original bang, which was in the occipital area. These are all findings that you would see on a CT scan and an MRI scan without requiring an autopsy if he had made it to the emergency room, without requiring an autopsy if he had made it to the emergency room, without requiring an autopsy if he had made it to the emergency room.
Do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty whether this injury, the laceration and the basal fracture, was caused by Mr. O'Keefe falling backwards on the ground?
My opinion is that that's what caused his whole injury. Well, the only way he could get this kind of an injury was to fall backwards, hit the back of his head, and then the resulting, energy forces going into his brain, into his base of his skull.
Would that type of laceration require Mr. O'Keefe to have hit a line type or ridge type object?
A ridge type of object?
Yes.
No, like I said, the tearing of the skin in that fashion, you could look it up, would be just a classic blunt trauma injury.
Is there anything about that injury that would suggest to you it had to have been something sharp or ridge-like to cause?
Objection, Your Honor. If you can request time to talk about this.
All right, we'll continue.
So as we were discussing, Dr. Wolf, you said this is a classic fall backwards. Is there anything about the pattern of that laceration that would suggest that there was a ridge or a line-type edge that caused that wound?
Not necessarily.
Is there anything about the pattern of that laceration that would suggest that there was a ridge or a line-type edge that caused that wound?
Not necessarily.
Can somebody suffer this type of injury simply by falling backwards?
Absolutely.
You had taken us through the process of falling backwards and then talked about what happens to the brain. Can I ask you a couple of detailed questions about that?
Sure.
When you explained that the brain upon impact then shifts forward and hits the front of the skull, is there a medical term for that process?
Well, the medical term is a coup contre coup injury. So the coup is when you first hit. In this case, it was the back of the head, as summarized by the laceration in the back of the head, and the contusions that the pathologist and the ME found in the back of the brain. And then the brain shifts forward, and as it's traveling at a certain velocity, because it's thrust forward on the floor of the base of the skull, it's getting bumped. And it's getting, again, you can think of it as a hammer hitting a thumb. It's getting black and blue in the areas that are sharpest.
Are there symptoms that result of the process coup contre coup?
This is clinically, it varies. You can go from anywhere from a simple concussion, where you sort of are unaware of what happened, but you're still awake, you're confused, all the way to, ultimately being in a coma.
Can this type of injury, the coup contre coup, and what you see in the review of your files, could this type of injury happen from an attack by a weapon, like a bat or a hammer?
Well, he did not have a depressed skull fracture. So any focal hit like that would more likely than not have caused a depressed skull fracture. Blunt trauma the way he had, the assumption, would cause the coup contre coup without a depressed skull fracture.
Happen from an attack by a weapon, like a bat or a hammer?
Well, he did not have a depressed skull fracture. So any focal hit like that would more likely than not have caused a depressed skull fracture. Blunt trauma the way he had, the assumption, would cause the coup contre coup without a depressed skull fracture.
Did you see any sign of orbital fractures in Mr. O'Keefe?
Yes, he had both the ME and the pictures taken and the neuropathologist mentioned fractures of the orbital roof.
Do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty how those fractures occur?
From the trauma.
Could you just explain a little bit how that would happen?
Well, as he fell backwards and he struck his head, it was clearly at a very high speed generated by the gravity. The bone, depending on the quality of his bone, the density, then generated forces. There's a certain amount of lateral give, and then you get a linear force going forward. It drives all the way up the clivus and forward into the anterior fossa where his orbital roofs lay. And this is why people like this get what they call raccoon's eyes. And this is why people like this get what they call raccoon's eyes. This is why people like this get what they call raccoon's eyes. Well, as he fell backwards and he struck his head, it was clearly at a very high speed. He fell backwards and he struck his head, it was clearly at a very high speed. As he fell backwards and he struck his head, it was clearly at a very high speed. The brain couldn't possibly cause a fracture. The fracture was caused by the forces generated through that clivus, that middle bone in the middle of his base of the skull.
Do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty whether or not the brain in any way could have caused these orbital fractures?
The answer is absolutely not.
In your study of the records and photographs, and in your experience treating these types of injuries, do you have an opinion, to a reasonable degree of medical certainty, whether or not a person would remain conscious or would be immediately unconscious after the impact of the ground?
Well, it's impossible to know whether he became immediately unconscious, but his injuries were very substantial, and it's more probable than not that at some point he quickly became unconscious and was unable to do functional activities.
What does functional activities mean?
The ability to, get himself up and about would be one of the functional activities. The ability to call for help would be a very significant cortical function. Would be one. Ability to call for help would be a very significant cortical function. The ability to call for help would be a very significant cortical function.
If a person does not have functional abilities because they are rendered unconscious, does their body, could it still move?
Yes, this is the interesting thing about our brains.
Would Mr. O'Keefe, in your study and opinion, have died immediately?
No.
Can you
I
show?
don't. Yes, I'll tell you. There's very few things that you head injury where you would die, quote, immediately. But traumatic head injuries, you would not die immediately. It's a process. And it's a process of a combination of things. Brain swelling, which takes a while to develop, decreased blood flow to your brain because you're getting swelling, and ultimately death of the brainstem that controls your heart and your breathing. And so the medical examiner took pictures of his periorbital area and diagnosed raccoon's eyes. So raccoon's eyes occur because there's leakage through the orbital fractures into the periorbital space.
Opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty whether Mr. O'Keefe died immediately or within 15 minutes?
No, I don't think he died immediately. Neither the hypothermia nor this kind of head injury would kill you immediately in any clinical experience I have. The medical examiner took pictures of his periorbital area and diagnosed raccoon's eyes. The medical examiner took pictures of his periorbital area and diagnosed raccoon's eyes. So raccoon's eyes occur because there's leakage through the orbital fractures into the periorbital space.
Opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty whether Mr. O'Keefe died immediately or within 15 minutes?
No, I don't think he died immediately. Neither the hypothermia nor this kind of head injury would kill you immediately in any clinical experience I have. No, I don't think he died immediately. Neither the hypothermia nor this kind of head injury would kill you immediately in any clinical experience I have. No, I don't think he died immediately. Neither the hypothermia nor this kind of head injury would kill you immediately in any clinical experience I have.